2013 was a year packed to the brim with games that triggered immense discussion. DMC Devil May Cry versus Metal Gear Rising, the battle of the action games. Last of Us, Bioshock Infinite, a new main GTA game, a Tomb Raider reboot, and believe it or not, the Xbox One and PS4 came out. And even then, you'd think it wouldn't be that easy to forget that a AAA mainline home console God of War game came out too. God of War Ascension. To put this into perspective, the previous example of that before Ascension was God of War 3 in 2010, one of the most hyped games of its era. One of the issues Ascension had when it came to getting people's attention was that God of War 3 delivered far too well on that hype, leaving little left over for any game after it. After God of War 2's cliffhanger, where we were promised that we would next get to experience Spartan warrior Kratos destroying the entirety of Mount Olympus, we were kept waiting 3 years, but God of War 3 delivered entirely on that promise. Poseidon, Hades, Kronos, Zeus, the Greek myth boss fight and cameo lineup was maxed out and at a total peak. Whether you were a returning player or a new player, at the time this game was the definitive, most spectacular way to do battle with the biggest characters of Greek mythology. And it might still be. Couple that with this being the first HD God of War, and you had an action game that was hard to ignore. That same year, God of War Ghost of Sparta, a handheld prequel to God of War 2, basically addressed any remaining major Greek myths and dangling threads of Kratos' story yet to be dealt with. We get Kratos tracking down his brother and mother, fighting Thanatos, a visit to Sparta during peacetime, and even the destruction of Atlantis to seal the deal. In a sense, Ghost of Sparta got to be an alternative God of War 2 we never got back on the PS2, with it following up on the original ending teaser from God of War 1 involving long-lost brother Deimos, in addition to its visual parity with the older titles, making it feel like some alternate history PS2 title. With all that in mind, God of War Ascension, another prequel set before every other game in the series, didn't have much left to work with. Even the concept of a pre-God of War 1 game had already been done with Chains of Olympus, so the novelty of a game set in that area of the timeline wasn't even completely up for grabs. In contrast to prior games, describe Ascension's premise and it sounds rather banal. Ascension basically explores how Kratos managed to free himself from servitude to the original God of War Ares, and how he escapes a jail he was put into for trying to get out of said bond. So essentially, a bit of god bureaucracy we didn't fully explain previously. The premise wasn't exactly the big selling point it once had been for this franchise, and perhaps that's one reason why Ascension feels like one of the most overlooked games in the series, despite production value on par with God of War 3. While the events of the game may not sound too exciting, if you're interested in seeing a fresh bit of perspective on Kratos' character, and are less concerned with dramatic revelations or groundbreaking universe-altering events, then there's still, I think, a good amount to enjoy about the narrative of Ascension. The novelty here is that we get to see a much more desperate, sad Kratos only a few months after being tricked by Ares into killing his own family. He's on the run from Ares and the Furies, who plan on punishing him for the desertion. It's cliched to put like this, but what we get here is a much more human Kratos than we've been used to seeing up to this point. He seems to have a few friends he cares about, reaches out to people about to die, and even acts a little cheeky.
Freedom.
Yes, freedom. Freedom from the Furies who relentlessly hunt you in the name of Ares, and ultimately, freedom from your bond to the God of War himself.
Break an oath with a god. Of all the minds in question, mine is not the one to worry about.
All while still clearly being the headstrong, defiant Kratos we've come to expect.
Place your offerings for Aletheia. We will decide if they are worthy at our will.
I offer nothing.
In a way, I see Kratos, by the time of God of War 3, on the whole as barely a character anymore, one-dimensional but by design. Rage and madness has completely overcome him, making him driven to one and only one goal no matter what the cost: gain more power, destroy Olympus. We do see a few cracks here and there throughout the journey of God of War 3 that indicate the shadow of a human being lies deep and buried within, though even that is perhaps being generous. Kratos' displays of humanity in that game come across more like an involuntary attempt to grasp at something with a phantom limb, more so than him exercising some part of his character he still actually has. By this point, he's more of a chaotic force than a person. The events of his life have warped him into a corrupted force of destruction and chaos, like the personification of a natural disaster. An embodiment of the type of larger-than-life legend people discuss with awe and disbelief through the years, passing their story down from generation to generation, assuming there's anybody left to. The being that scaled Mount Olympus and killed the gods, a mythic figure we get to embody. There's no afterwards, no home to go back to, just that one goal. Could a mere person with the kind of feelings and self-doubt that come with that accomplish such a feat? No, only a single-minded, insane monster could. Ascension, though, is about escaping rather than merely destroying. It's the first step we see this character take to getting out from under the thumb of somebody and become someone or something known for spitting in the face of fate and authority at every turn. It's cool because we get a glimpse of what that force of death, that legend, was like before succumbing completely to rage. Like I said a moment ago, we see someone sad and desperate, longing for meaning and purpose after losing it all. Unable to find it, that longing turns to frustration, which turns to taking it out on those responsible and tangentially responsible, those in the way of him getting to those prior two groups, all the way up the chain of command until nobody's left. Throughout the series, Kratos wants to be rid of his nightmares and madness, and in Ascension he basically gets presented that option. But if it's at the cost of serving the god who gave them to him and letting him go scot-free, it isn't worth it. He makes that sacrifice so he can oppose Ares, and in doing so halts a plan to overthrow Olympus, which according to Ascension, I suppose is what Ares was still trying to do come God of War 1 as well. Chains of Olympus, the other prequel set before God of War 1, also ends with Kratos committing a pretty selfless act for him, and a fairly big favor to the gods. These prequel games put into perspective why Kratos would be pretty miffed that no success and no deed done to help those with power grants him with the easing of the madness and nightmares he's burdened with. After so many huge favors, the one reward they manage to grant him at the end of God of War 1 is an honor they're pretty quick to want to take away again. It's not that weird, then, that with no other options, Kratos, getting crazier and crazier, just keeps taking the revenge route. There's at least satisfaction in defiance, even if fleeting, and it all starts here with his choice to not comply. There's a reason this game's key visual is a chained-up Kratos. He looks uncharacteristically unassuming, with a defeated look about him, head hung in shame. Yet we know what happens next once this caged beast is let loose. A colossal rampage that will span multiple games. Are you the one ready to set him free and start that rampage at its inception? The first 5 games are about a cycle of violence perpetuating itself and not really solving anything. It's a pretty basic theme at its core, and Ascension isn't really about anything too different than those games. But there's a novelty provided from getting to see this characterization of an early Ghost of Sparta. There's certainly worse reasons to have another God of War campaign than getting to see the first link in the long chain that leads to the monster we get by God of War 3. That said, it's still a prequel that focuses more on the how of something happened more so than the why. I'm usually more interested in the latter than in the former when it comes to prequels. How Kratos breaks free of Ares and chooses to help Olympus in exchange for release from his nightmares is far less interesting than why he would come to the decision to do so. But a story about why isn't really necessary at this point. We find out all we really need to know about that in the original game, where all the groundwork is first laid out. But this is God of War, so how something happened still gets to be one hell of a spectacle. Whether you find God of War's chain of violence narrative compelling or not, it certainly serves the gameplay well. We the players are happy to let Kratos go to the well of defiance over and over for that hit of cathartic retribution, because it's certainly satisfying for us too. Even if poor Kratos never gets the release from his pain that he's actually looking for. Seeing Kratos break his shackles in Ascension and tear through a so-called inescapable prison, shocking his captors, is tremendously satisfying, a microcosm of everything that's to come. I think it's especially satisfying here because it's early in his career as a killer of immortals, and they're not seeing it coming. His escape from this unjust imprisonment is one of the most justified rampages Kratos goes on in his career as this Greek myth berserker. Ascension begins with this really cool self-contained little chapter. Kratos starts chained up, getting tortured by Megara the Fury, and you have to perform this little dodge and counter minigame to rebuff her and get free. Immediately chaos ensues as Kratos is let loose in the prison. Megara sends parasite monsters after you and awakens the Titan Hecatoncheires to smash you, who we discover basically is the prison. All hell is breaking loose as you jump between colossal structures with the prison's foundations shifting under the Titan. It's extremely well directed and everything comes full circle when at the end of the chapter we catch up with Megara and perform the same minigame from the start, only this time as a finishing move. It's an amazing opener. God of War 3's combat gets refined and tweaked here. There are some minor controversial changes, but regardless of how you feel about those, this remains, if not the most complex action game, definitely an extremely satisfying one, with still a lot to play around with and consider. It goes without saying that Kratos' chain blades are the heart of the combat. It's their extreme versatility that makes God of War easy to pick up and play, while still giving players looking to experiment a lot of options. Close range, long range, launch, slam, grab, throw, all in one weapon. God of War 3's chain grab is taken a step further here, letting you hook an enemy with one chain while hitting other enemies with the other. I like how the chains are still super responsive in Ascension, but have just this tiny extra bit of weight afforded to them, giving them a little bit more of a tangible heft when grabbing enemies and objects alike. This time you get to switch your chains between 4 elemental statuses, and on the fly mid-combo too, which is excellent. The actual effect most combo strings have on enemies is pretty similar across elemental statuses, though each status has a few special moves that are significantly different, so it's great to be able to switch almost instantly between the ones assigned to each element. As a result, while its use is perhaps niche, on-the-fly switching is still a cool feature. It is perhaps a shame that Kratos doesn't get to permanently add any other melee weapon of significantly different design to his permanent repertoire though. In this title, Kratos can pick up weapons like swords and shields off the ground, but they can only be used for a limited time, and don't become part of your permanent arsenal. Basically like old-school temporary power-ups. Although the limited uses precluded me from really investing much in them, I do kind of like the idea of a scrappy Kratos quickly finding or even stealing a blunt object to mash an enemy with. One of my favorite things about the character is how practically minded he is. He measures the worth of everything on how useful it is for the task at hand. He's totally goal-driven and cares very little for possessions. He has no reverence for most of the objects he finds, no matter their implied historical or monetary value. Once it's served its purpose, he throws it away. With these temporary weapon pickups, it's cool in a way to see the character's ethos, his lack of attachment to material things, have a presence in the gameplay. That said, I think at minimum, a permanent, projectile weapon of some kind, like the bow from 3, would have probably been a neat inclusion. The weak link here is magic. It's pretty uninvolved no matter how you slice it. You hit the button and take a break for a few seconds while damage is dealt across the screen. It feels substantially out of step with what's possible within the combat system elsewhere. The most controversial change, which I alluded to earlier, is probably the new rage system. In previous God of Wars, over time, engaging in combat, you'd fill up a meter that could be then discharged to make Kratos very powerful for a limited time. This time you can also build up said meter, and much faster than before, but instead of activating this super powered up form manually, Kratos will remain in a more powerful form for as long as the meter is filled. The change is that you'll lose meter if you take damage, so getting hit while in the powered up rage state will deactivate it. This means you have to play very efficiently to keep Kratos in that state. The plus side being that if you keep doing so, you can keep Kratos in that rage mode for much longer. There's more to consider though. Some moves that in previous games could be used at any time are now relegated to rage mode only, such as Spirit of Hercules and Valor of Hercules. This means to do these powerful moves, you'll have to continuously play without taking damage. On its own, I quite like this idea, since these two combos are essentially a way to just do an extra powerful slam and an extra powerful swipe respectively. It's not like relegating them to rage mode really denies the player major combo opportunities elsewhere. I think where this system is going to sour for most though is that again, these moves didn't used to be locked off this way. If the developers had created some new combos to be rage exclusive, instead of using old ones, this would have come off a lot better, because otherwise I quite like the new rage system. On top of being more powerful with extra moves while this bar is maxed, the player also has the option to spend the whole meter for one powerful special attack depending on the element they currently have active. This gives the player a lot to consider while fighting from moment to moment. Once the bar is full, they'll have to decide whether to use up the gauge for this special attack or to conserve the field meter to have access to the more powerful moves they only now have open to them. All while keeping in mind that both options will become unavailable if Kratos gets hit with a maxed bar. The pressure is on. Since the combo counter in God of War doesn't go down if you take damage, this new version of the rage meter gave an even greater incentive to avoid damage while still trying to get hits in to keep said counter up. Other little tweaks have been added, such as parries requiring a 2-button press instead of 1, as well as a slightly longer animation, which in fairness does discourage tapping block willy-nilly like in prior games to get an easy counter in. All in all, Ascension is much more demanding than previous games mechanically. I think the restrictions make for some interesting choices in combat that have you considering your approach more than before. But if your kind of God of War is about total anarchy and destruction, with the fun coming from a complete lack of limitation, you may still be in the camp that prefers God of War 3. I know that I like to go back and forth between both approaches. I think each approach matches the context and story of each game appropriately. I will say that stun moves like Hermes Boots in 3 were a lot more fun than the simple point-and-click stun abilities present in Ascension. Luckily, also, God of War Ascension is more than happy to give you the option to let loose and play with all kinds of cheats on New Game Plus if you just want to let loose. So Unlimited Rage is yours for the taking if you just want to mess around. In terms of level and world design, for the bulk of this game we get a much more subdued and low-key God of War adventure contextually, but no less grandiose on a visual level or in terms of scale. There's something kind of refreshing about seeing Kratos on a more humble quest for a change, exploring a ruined town in search of a hidden mystical temple. Though that temple is obviously located up a big mountain, so we can get some scale going. I won't beat around the bush, this game looks amazing. I can't imagine the PS3 being pushed much further with this level of scale and detail while running at, well, at least over 30 frames. It's uncapped. You'll get some smooth hallways that might get close to 60 frames per second. Unfortunately, for some reason, cutscenes can get extremely choppy. though thankfully the frame rate during gameplay never gets quite this bad. It's criminal that only God of War 3 got a PS4 port that runs locked at 60 FPS and at 1080p. This game is crying out for 1080p or even 4K. Moving through these environments is a mixed bag. Sometimes the connective tissue between parts of the environment in God of War can be a lot of fun to move through. Like the grappling, yeah, it's not that involved, but it's fast and looks cool. It feels good, and there's a tiny amount of timing required to pull it off. Ascension, though, adds Uncharted-style climbing, which is much less enjoyable. You can't fall, you can't fail, you just point where to go. I'm not saying God of War games can't have some downtime, I just don't know if this is the approach the quieter moments should take. The puzzles, though simple, and with probably still a bit too much block pushing going on, are perhaps a better use of time. The time puzzles in the Temple of Delphi were pretty cool, hitting a switch to decay or heal the environment, and seeing what you can accomplish during each of the opposing states. Ironically, these time puzzles become less involving when Kratos gets complete control over the power, and it becomes more a question of finding the right spot to interact with something than either pressing left or right. It can look suitably epic for God of War though. While on the subject of environmental diversions, the Mario 64 slides are better than the climbing, but still feel needlessly restrictive. I don't know why the game doesn't just let us jump manually when we want on these, instead of restricting Kratos' jumps to button prompts. These slides probably could have gotten more complex with the freedom to jump. The biggest nitpick of this review will be this one grapple point, which for some reason, despite showing the universal tell for grappling in this game, a glowing orb, asks the player to press X instead of the grapple button, which is R1. QuickTime events that involve moving the sticks are also so infrequent here that when they do pop up, they're far more likely to catch you off guard in a somewhat unfair way. On the topic of on-screen button prompts, Ascension has the nicest looking ones of the series up to this point. Rather than putting the PlayStation TM symbols on screen as they are on the controller, we get custom designs with a much more appropriate aesthetic for the game. Volcanic rock PlayStation for ancient Greece. On the other hand, the new auto-save system triggers this ugly grey PlayStation UI save icon that keeps popping up all the time. Manual saving in 3 made us look at the PlayStation's green save bar, which, again, not ideal in ancient Greece, but at least that didn't appear during the action. I don't want these nitpicks to downplay how much I like the presentation of Ascension overall. It's not perfect, but it's God of War combat at some of its most visceral and challenging from a mechanical perspective, presented with some incredible direction. Tense epic music and dynamic camera frames situations in a way as to make Kratos look like he's hanging on by a thread, his demeanor giving you this sense he's surviving by pure force of will at times. The combat rewarding us with the most brutal and chaotic moves through perseverance does an excellent job at making us feel like we're embodying that will and that rage that's keeping him alive. I think it's appropriate that in the game where we see the precarious point at which either Kratos begins the path to becoming the legend he is in all the other games, or fades away forever, that the gameplay reflects that by being a bit more of a challenge. Keeping our own chances at success on a precarious edge too, with punishing mechanics like the tug-of-war of the new Rage meter. In 2013's action game discourse, DMC Devil May Cry and Metal Gear Rising got a lot of attention for their left-field choices, but I think ultimately as an overall experience, I like Ascension more than either of them. DMC Devil May Cry may have the deeper mechanics, Rising may have more interesting things to say, but both suffered from shortcomings which I addressed in my video comparing the two that place them below Ascension for me. In terms of consistency, Ascension is just rock solid in comparison from start to finish, with far higher production value to go along with that. An action game of this quality wouldn't push currently available console technology as much as this again for quite a while afterwards. There were a few other quality action games in between, but they got relegated to platforms like the Wii U, while the more powerful PS4 remained fairly scarce when it came to quality action for a while. So now that we're nearing this video's end, I think it's appropriate to transition from looking at Ascension from a release point of view to a present-day point of view. In 2018, we got the first new God of War since Ascension, and it's an interesting title to compare it to. They both give us a, relatively speaking, more subdued Kratos, but each from a different side of his peak as the Ghost of Sparta. Ascension before and 2018 after. From a gameplay perspective, the 2018 God of War wasn't my cup of tea, but its story did have a few highlights. My initial apprehension towards the story was skepticism of how logistically we'd get Kratos to a point where we could tell this new story after 3. I can see how Ascension Kratos became God of War 3 Kratos, but how do we get from 3 to 2018 Kratos? With the world in ruin and Kratos coming off a mad murder spree to a peaceful Kratos in the beautiful woods? The answer is they just basically skipped those logistics. I suppose fair play to them there. PS4 God of War saw more success than Ascension, and I think that's mainly because it presents a fresher shell for its more vulnerable Kratos. A new console for the series, new gods, new world, new character dynamic for Kratos, and if it's your cup of tea, even new gameplay and the way the action is framed. Meanwhile, Ascension has the benefit of a style of gameplay that's been refined over the course of 5 prior games, but it's set in the old setting of Greece with an almost depleted roster of Greek myth A-listers. It can't even sell itself with the premise of being a pre-God of War 1 game, since even that had already been done before. Even with a slight shift in demeanor and approach to character dynamics, the overall structure of the game still remains fairly similar to past entries. Kratos launching himself solo towards whatever thing he needs to for 8 to 10 hours. All this on a system nearing the end of its life, which we'd already had the shock of seeing the franchise appear on. No single one of these attributes would perhaps be a deal breaker by itself, but in conjunction, it's hard to see these potentially negative characteristics getting trumped in the eyes of the mainstream consumer by other more positive descriptors like solid and consistent. There's the novelty of multiplayer, but that's hard to use as a USP for a previously single-player only series. Also, I can't seem to get into it anymore. Even though I swear I have played this mode at some point, it says I need to re-buy an online pass to play, which I'm not gonna do. Though I hear it's a pretty fun mode that you might enjoy if you get in and the servers remained up. Maybe it says something though that whenever I boot up these old action games with multiplayer modes, I can just never seem to get into a match for a video. Anyway, for me, the best of both worlds would be a God of War with the combat of old, combined with the exciting new world and premise of Norse God of War. A game that presents the combat sections in a more old-school fashion to maximize their potential, but zooms in and gets more intimate for the story and character development. But it's not that simple. One of the appeals of the new God of War is its serene, detailed winter wonderland environment. You could see why to some it would be appealing to play simply to hang out in these chill places. And in a way, Kratos' more subdued personality for the bulk of the title, his new outlook and the relatively lower amount of spectacle afforded to the combat, is more in line with that calmer world and the tone it tries to set. But Santa Monica's interpretation of Greek mythology is such an ugly world. Oh, it looks nice, but the monsters are disgusting, and the people are naive and pathetic and sycophantic. Those with even a modicum of power are pompous and arrogant, and as Kratos you feel almost justified in just tearing the fuck out of all of it. Ascension is kind of a mix. Kratos is still angry, his rage triggered by a call to finally defy those who attempt to control him, so we get spectacle beyond anything in 2018 God of War. But on the flip side, reflecting his sadness and pre-rage mode outlook in Ascension, we also get, as mentioned, a more subdued journey in places, contextually, compared to previous games. The world reflects the character and the gameplay that character is capable of. While something like God of War 3 is like one long scream in setting and context and gameplay from start to finish, it's not as simple, I think, as slapping the gameplay from Ascension or 3 into 2018 God of War and calling it a day. I think you might start to lose the experience's overall cohesion, so to speak, as more than just the combat would be affected. You'd have different elements of the overall game's design pulling in quite disparate directions. You'd be creating an overall awkward marriage. Perhaps an intentionally disparate amalgamation of elements like that could be cool, but also quite weird and avant-garde, which I don't think is an overall feel a series this mainstream would be aiming for. I think God of War should try and keep a uniformity across both its gameplay and narrative. So if you want a more placid world in God of War, yeah, I think the gameplay has to follow that lead a little bit and vice versa. Perhaps there is room to creep back to the old presentation and style of combat in the as of writing unreleased God of War Ragnarok. Ragnarok seems like it will be an extremely ugly situation, perfect for ramping up the combat perhaps back closer to where it was before, while continuing the threads laid out by 2018 God's story. Or perhaps Santa Monica will stick to their guns and not move too far from the formula of PS4 God of War that saw success. Considering the overall positive response 2018 God of War got, I'd say it's unlikely they'll change course drastically now again. This segment will probably be outdated in like a month, but whatever. Either way, if you're looking for a mixture of a more complex Kratos with intense old-school God of War gameplay, and you haven't tried Ascension, I recommend it. I really like this game a lot, and while I wouldn't elevate its character or combat to masterpiece territory, it's a title I get a big kick out of when I go back to it. With the series continuing onwards into the future, now more than ever, you get this real cool primitive energy from this game's world, like you're seeing the dawn of time compared to how far Kratos ends up traveling beyond this stage of his origin. These old hallowed grounds represent his first steps towards becoming a slayer of gods, to becoming the God of War.